Going where the silence is. The QUO podcast.
Welcome to the QUO podcast. I'm Ali. Today I'm going to be speaking to writer, filmmaker, and author of Puff Piece, John Safran. Puff Piece investigates Philip Morris and their attempt to rebrand from big tobacco company contributing to the 8 million deaths from traditional cigarettes a year to a supposedly socially minded startup innovator, bold enough to imagine a smoke-free future and provide the very smokers they hooked on cigarettes with a so-called better alternative, the IQOS, all the time while continuing to sell cigarettes and aggressively marketing them to developing countries. Thanks for joining me, John.
No, thank you.
Why did you set your sights on Philip Morris, and why do you think their actions weren't eliciting much rage in the community before your book?
I was just minding my own business a couple of World No Tobacco Days ago. And World No Tobacco Day, that's the United Nations, because they're against cancer. So they're trying to end cigarettes. And Philip Morris, the Marlboro people, they took out a full-page advertisement on the eve of World No Tobacco Day saying we are shutting down as a cigarette company and relaunching as a health enterprise dedicated to getting the 1 billion smokers of the world, including our own customers, off cigarettes. And I was like, wow. I was like, is this like the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of apartheid? Because like things happen. You know, so it's not like, even though it sounds strange, like it could be like the end of cigarettes. And Philip Morris are just saying, yeah, we've got to stop or whatever. And then I started poking around a bit, and you'll never guess it. You can't always take what the makers of Marlboro cigarettes say at face value. Sometimes the makers of Marlboro cigarettes have a little slippery second agenda. And I was so fascinated both by this story of them relaunching as a health enterprise, or trying to get away with relaunching as a health enterprise, and then also that this incredible thing was going unnoticed. And I was so confused by it at first. I mean, and so this is so consequential what they're doing. This isn't like McDonald's says we've got healthier alternatives and everyone's like, bullshit, we know Big Macs make us fat, and we get it, you're going to say they're healthier because they've got salad in them or something, but we get it or whatever. This isn't like that. This is like such a brand new, the most audacious hustle I've ever seen.
Well, you make a really compelling argument as to why we should care deeply about like cigarettes and tobacco companies, but you also in your book sort of touch upon whether this is like a generational issue between what riles up millennials and Gen Zs and what riles up Gen Xers. And this idea that, corporations more broadly are no longer public enemy number one. Sort of, I feel like there's been this acknowledgement that everyone's complicit in corporate tactics to a degree, and it's sort of impossible to escape this completely, but you can mitigate it. And this idea that, another thing that you kind of touch upon is this idea that rejecting corporations entirely is potentially a privilege. So why do you think there's been a culture shift around the way corporations are viewed, which, in turn mitigates and determines what kind of makes people really angry and riled up? What do you think it says about how society is changing, and do you like the way society is changing?
Well, to give like a backdrop, when I'm Generation X, and when we were at university and we were progressives, like corporations were just seen as the be all and not the be all end all, but the top of the pyramid of explaining why there were problems in the world. And so even if you were like a good corporation, you're still kind of a bad corporation because you're still a corporation. It was just how the world was seen by progressives, and companies were seen as, even if they weren't explicitly doing this, but they were just seen as, if you own a corporation, whatever it is, it's kind of right wing. Like corporations are right wing, like capitalism's right wing, and we're left wing. And for instance, advertisements for corporations were they tapped into things like family values of nuclear families and conservative values and patriotism, and being, in the case of America, very patriotic to America, and in the case of Australia, patriotic to Australia. Like, that's just corporations. That was just a starting point of like viewing corporations that way. And there's just been this shift in the backdrop of the world that it's just changed, because there's been the introduction. I think part of it is there's new kind of corporate behemoths like Apple and Google. And for whatever reason, and maybe there's good reasons, and, you know, like, I'm not whatever, but for whatever reason, Apple, Google, these new big corporate behemoths that have decided that on a veneer, at least, and possibly on a deeper level, I don't want to be too cynical or whatever, that they're not going to go with their advertising. The way they project their company brand is not going to be, we're patriotic and we're into the nuclear family or whatever. They're going to say that we're into these progressive values, where we think it's outrageous that Black people, LGBT plus people are treated in a way, treated in a bad way. And we're going to, so that corporations just now, the perception of it by young progressive people is different to the perception of corporations back when I was a kid. Like, now they're seen as maybe a force for good. Maybe they're not seen as right wing or whatever, for better or worse. I'm just laying out the lay of the land here, by the way. I'm not even like saying whether it's good or bad. And I'm not even saying like maybe Google and Apple are sincerely progressive, and maybe that's a good thing or whatever. It's not that. It's just like, I'm trying to get in the heads of any of the youth who are listening to this, that I can't tell you how this just was not the perception of, like, if you're progressive back when I was younger. So I discovered in my book that, not that Philip Morris are intentionally doing this or whatever, but they just happen to be the happy beneficiaries of the fact that we're not looking at corporations as being the big public enemy, number one danger of the world anymore. And I kind of, in a comedic way, like, point out some of these kind of tangles and ironies in that I say, and I'm sure people would go, yeah, that's good, yeah, that makes sense or whatever, that if a Philip Morris executive had posts on Instagram, a photo of them hunting a lion on safari in Africa, and they've got the dead lion that they just shot with their rifle, that would go viral. That would be like, this is a moral problem, and Philip Morris, the Marlboro cigarette people, would have to go into damage control. Like, there's an executive and he went on a hunting safari in Africa and there's a dead lion, and they've posted, the executive probably lose their job or whatever. And then it's like, but compare that with the fact that these executives are complicit and run a company that, like, kills 8 million people a year. And we're just in 2021, and we're in this like really interesting landscape where somehow that's not unwoke.
If you are enjoying this podcast, head to thequo.com.au and follow us on our socials using the handle @thequoau.
So it's interesting that they're able to, yeah, as you say, maintain this veneer of wokeness, when even just the fact that they're aggressively marketing cigarettes in places like the Philippines should be enough to kind of recognize how they're sort of targeting developing nations and marginalized groups in the very same breath as saying that they support them.
Yeah, I mean, when this book really came alive to me, because, I mean, people who don't know me, I'm like a comedian and I'm a storyteller. And I actually think I'm like driven by storytelling more than I'm driven, for instance, by like, or at least that's my like number one. That's what I think about in my head when I'm pursuing these things or pursuing my books or my TV shows. I'm going, oh, what's a story? And I get really excited by stories. And even though on some subconscious level or on some secondary level, there might be this, that means there's this morality tale. Like, in my head, I'm just way more excited. What gets me excited is like stories and like things that haven't been told yet or whatever. So what really, I remember when I was looking into this, what really like just really animated me about following this story was when I saw that Philip Morris through a foundation that's fully funded by Philip Morris. So there's something called the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. So that sounds like Quit Victoria or the World Health Organization. But the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, even though it's got this, it says it's non-profit and all this stuff like that, they're 100% funded by Philip Morris, the Marlboro cigarette people. And anyway, they 100% sponsor and fund this Maori Indigenous health organization in New Zealand. And this Indigenous health organization that advocates for Indigenous health in New Zealand, 100% sponsored, funded by Philip Morris and Marlboro people. They come up with these arguments, these thoroughly modern arguments for why like governments and non-profits shouldn't be trying to encourage Maori people to stop smoking. And their argument is, and it's so audacious, but sort of like so fascinating. You got to kind of respect them in some weird way. So their argument is that that when you have people who aren't Maori, noting that there's even that's a bit of a fudge, because it's like Maori people are also noticing that there's Maori people. Anyway, when you have these organizations who are saying Maori people are smoking at a much higher rate, therefore they're dying, so therefore we should have campaigns that are trying to encourage Maori people to stop smoking. So this Philip Morris funded Indigenous organization, their spin on that is that these outside groups are like colonizers. So, so the World Health Organization, or like New Zealand, whatever their version of Quit Victoria is, that when they're kind of doing a campaign saying, hey, you should get off cigarettes because like you're going to die, to Maori people, that's like they're Captain Cook, like colonizing, like telling Indigenous people what to do. And, in this Black Lives Matter world, like where the hell do people who aren't Maori be telling Maori people what to do? Like that's racist. So people trying to lower Maori people from smoking are somehow colonizers like Captain Cook. And I can't even quite get my head together. Somehow Philip Morris are Eddie Marbo in all of this. So because they're not telling Philip Morris and Marlboro people aren't telling Marlboro people to stop smoking Marlboros. So therefore that's Indigenous sovereignty, because it's allowing Indigenous people to do what they want. And when I read this, I was just like, man, this is so like stimulating. Like I don't want to sound like a real opportunist or whatever like that. I was like, this is insane. And I was really interested because I was kind of on some level aware that companies do this whole woke thing. And so I was, even though I found it fascinating them getting into the gay community and sort of doing that, I was like, oh, yeah, I accepted that. Like I expected that, that's, companies have been very woke. But when they were like just doing this absolutely audacious thing of pitching people who are trying to reduce Maori health rates, Maori cigarette smoking rates, as being Captain Cook, I was like, this is insane. No one's ever written about this before. And everyone else would be scared to write about this, except for me, because I'm a storytelling kamikaze. And so I'm definitely the person to write about this, because I'll find this fascinating, and I'll also not like be kind of like, oh, maybe they're right. Maybe I don't want to be a white outsider telling this story or whatever like that.
Yeah, no, I find that really interesting. I've got a question about Dr. Glover a bit later, but before we go on, I just wanted you to explain what an IQOS / heat stick is and how it exists in this space between a vape and a traditional cigarette. Yes,
that's very important to establish. So Philip Morris, faced with this problem that menthol cigarettes are being banned across Europe and were banned across Europe in 2020, they said, okay, we'll go along with that. And then they said, oh, listen, we've got this new product whilst we've got your attention. And God knows it's not a cigarette. And then they show the product, and I'm holding it up here. I don't know, is this like an audio or a video podcast?
It's an audio podcast, but I can see that it looks like a cigarette to me. It looks much like a cigarette.
So it's tobacco rolled in paper with a filter at one end that you plant between your lips inhaling nicotine and tobacco into your lungs, which you then exhale a discharge that looks really a lot like smoke and contains smoke constituents. But there, Philip Morris is saying this isn't a cigarette. And it's like, why is it not a cigarette? And they've done a few little linguistic things that's got to do with words and bending meaning and language, and then also a few little nudges and reframing exactly how it works. That's slightly different to how a cigarette works, they claim. And so they claim this isn't a cigarette. And then amazingly, it works. So all across Europe now, you can go to Germany or Slovenia or whatever, you can't buy menthol cigarettes. And so this would have been an incredible beginning of the end for Philip Morris. But you can buy menthol heat sticks that just look exactly like a cigarette, but shorter. So the reason, probably a way to explain what this is because it's a very complicated thing, is to explain what a cigarette is and then say how a cigarette's different to a vape, and then how this new product, what we're talking about, is also different to a vape. So a cigarette contains tobacco leaf, and tobacco leaf is infused with nicotine, and nicotine occurs naturally in tobacco. So, and what happens is when you light a cigarette, it generates tar. So you're inhaling tar, and tar's what is the main thing that kills you in a cigarette, right? So then you've got vaping, right? And vapes have, with that, you're heating up like liquid, and it contains nicotine because you can extract nicotine from tobacco. So you can have the nicotine without the tobacco. So a vape contains nicotine, propylene glycerol, other flavorings and other agents, and that's heated up and you inhale that into your lungs. But because it doesn't contain tobacco leaf, it doesn't generate tar. And because it doesn't generate tar, someone who's pro-vaping can fairly say, and it's the truth, that the most deadly thing that's in a cigarette, tar generated by tobacco leaf, is not in a vape because it doesn't contain any tobacco leaf, right? Anyway, and then it becomes this other argument where, like, okay, fine, it doesn't, with vaping, it doesn't contain tobacco leaf, so it's not generating tar, but you're still inhaling things into your lungs, into your system that could have consequence and, perhaps dire consequences. That's, separate to the fact that it doesn't generate tar. But anyway, let's park that to one side. Anyway, so the reason this heat stick that Philip Morris are putting out is different to a vape is because it does contain tobacco leaf. So therefore it does generate tar. Therefore the thing in this heat stick, which they're like pitching as their big, gear shift, we're not like we once were. Like, this contains tar, like a cigarette contains tar. So, and the tar's the thing that is the main danger in a cigarette. So, it's a pretty audacious move. Philip Morris putting out this cigarette and saying it's not a cigarette, it's a heat stick.
What you just said sort of really highlights how Philip Morris, and I mean a lot of corporations, but especially Philip Morris, uses language to manipulate people, to misrepresent things, to sort of cover their hypocrisy, basically. And you've touched on it before, but they're also good at shape shifting. Like you said, the Foundation for Smoke-Free Future is exclusively funded by them. So do you think that the community needs to think more critically about the way corporations use language to avoid accountability? And I guess as a member of the community who kind of wants to be more critical about this and not be taken down all these rabbit holes from their shenanigans, how can we sort of cut through the bullshit in the words to sort of actually be able to make choices based on what their product is, not on what their product sort of purports to be, when they're so adept at using language to sort of lure us in?
Yeah, I like what I learned through this book is that people in power, whether that's politicians or companies or whoever, they're really astute and alert to how language builds the world and words build the world. So in the case of Philip Morris, like with their smoke thing, so there's a discharge coming out of this tobacco product that kind of looks like smoke and contains smoke constituents. And they're like, okay, let's figure out a way that it's not smoke, even though it's this discharge from tobacco leaf that contains smoke constituents. So that they realize like this is a word war as much as it's a science war. And once you win the word war, you get to kind of create a reality in the world. So Philip Morris's like big challenge, which they just had the audacity to do, and it paid off and it worked, was how do we put out a cigarette and just say it's not a cigarette? And because it's like the word cigarette is so powerful and has so much meaning to it, and has so much heat and so much toxicness attached to it. I'm talking about the word, not the product. So so our game as Philip Morris is not only to go into science labs and try to, work out a way that this cigarette isn't a cigarette from a science point of view. It's to go to the dictionary to try to like create a reality where this isn't a cigarette, because we're going to bend the meaning of words. We're going to evaporate words that have toxic backstories to them. And again, I say that on a linguistic level, not a science level. Like the word tar has this toxicity attached to it, like in linguistically, So how do we free ourselves, and how do we continue as a company? And that's as much a word game as a science game. And so in this like postmodern world where we all get to define our realities and say, well, words have meanings, or words have the meanings that I put on them, you've got to understand that, like, hey, that's fine, I guess, like on some like local level or some smaller personal level. Like I get to define things and I get to say who I am and whatever. But you got to understand that like companies, and like in this case, companies that don't have your best interests at heart, in fact, have your heart not at heart, because they say they want you to inhale tobacco and tar, that they're going to take advantage of this. They're going to take advantage of this new world in which, like I touch on this in my book, that we're living through a fertile time where language and words and meanings are all up for grabs, and things are being redefined, and corporations are going to take advantage of that.
Exactly. In your book, you also seem to be grappling with whether accepting freebies from Philip Morris, like a lunch or the potential of a trip to their research hub in Switzerland, is fundamentally compromising. And other people in your book sort of highlight that saying no to the support of corporations like Philip Morris, is a form of privilege that not everyone can take. But when it comes down to it, do you think accepting funding in and of itself is compromising, or like, do you ever really get something for no strings attached when Philip Morris's whole game is sort of on lobbying based on promoting people who might have sort of similar or complementary opinions or beliefs or tactics to them?
This is where I'm the perfect guy to be exploring this and telling the story, because I'm just so drawn to all the tangles and the complexities. And when I say a tangle or a complexity, rather than like a lot of other people, if they're like either a journalist or an activist, they'd be going, oh, hang on, this is complicated and this might make Philip Morris look good or something like that. I can't do this. I'm like the opposite. I'm running towards the complexity. So I really heard out, and I feel in this book I explained this really complicated thing, which I imagine most people haven't thought about before, where this Maori dude's telling me, he's saying, you got to understand that as Maori people, we've been like screwed over by the non-Maori, the white government, and we don't particularly trust them, and for good reason, right? So when Philip Morris comes in and says, we want to help fund you and we want to maybe fund research and things like that. Like, we're not idiots. We know Philip Morris. We know they've got their own agenda, but you know, like the non-Maori government, sort of like they fund things. They're funding science. They've also got their agenda, and just because of our particular backstory with the non-Maori government, we're like, sure, we're cynical about Philip Morris, but we're also cynical about the government as well. So, and that's why he explained why he was happy for Maori people to accept funding from Philip Morris. And then this Black American woman, a friend of mine, she was also telling me that this whole thing of not accepting money from corporations, like I brought up this thing with her where I said, oh, you know, when I was growing up, I noticed that if you were like a grunge band, and like grunge bands were generally white, it's like the worst thing to do would be to be seen as attached to like a corporate sponsor. And so Pearl Jam were like, we will not be working with Ticketek because they're a corporate behemoth. And then I said, I noticed at exactly the same cultural moment as that was happening, hip hop bands like which were largely black, and I point to like Run DMC, who were like, this was happening parallel to grunge, that they were happy to promote that, hey, Adidas is sponsoring us, or whoever is sponsoring us. And she said, and this Black American woman said something parallel to what that Maori dude told me, that she said, like, it's sort of like a bit of white privilege to be like saying, oh, we're not going to accept money from corporations because, you know, you've worked out how to get money other ways, or you've already got money or whatever. And she says that this was her thing, not mine, where she said, as a Black American, it's like all money is going to be tarnished, wherever it comes by. And so we're not necessarily going to be thinking that taking money from a corporation is somehow more tainted than taking money, for instance, like public funding, which is from a government that has like screwed over Black people over the years. So, I mean, that's one thing I learned in the book from that. And like other things in my book, there's not really an answer to that. It's not like, then I hear that and then I make my ruling. It's just like the world is fascinatingly complex with lots of loose ends, which is like good for a storyteller, obviously. But obviously some other people just aren't comfortable with that. But yeah, I mean, at the very least, you can understand why maybe a Maori person from New Zealand or a Black American is like less concerned about like, oh my God, I'm selling out if I take money from this corporation, than maybe some, you know, white person is.